All right, welcome everyone to our fourth session of the day. If you're just joining us, it's day one of Talent Exchange Live, brought to you by the HR Exchange Network. Just as a reminder, we are giving away a $100 Amazon gift card to our audience members. It's based on participation, so the more engaged you are with the session, asking questions, answering our survey, which is there on your screen, and so forth, the higher the chance you have for winning that gift card. All right, on to our presentation. It's entitled Creating a Caring Culture to Attract and Retain Talent. We have two presenters for this presentation, Laura Hamill, Chief People Officer, Chief Science Officer for Limeade, and Julianne Tillmann, People Science Team Lead for Limeade Institute. Laura, Julia, thank you for joining us. It's always fantastic to have you. Take it away.
Thank you for this nice introduction, Mason. We are excited to be here today and to share what we know about creating a caring organization to attract and retain talent. And in this session today, we'll go through just the history of work and how workplaces are shifting, then spend some time on the importance of care, and then really get into how do you create a caring workplace. And this is Julianne Tillmann speaking. As Mason mentioned, I am joined today by Laura Hamill, and she is going to walk us through the history of work.
Thank you, Julia. So I think it's maybe relevant to say, Julia and I, our backgrounds are that we have PhDs in organizational psychology, so the study of work. So this is right up our alley. We get really excited about this kind of topic, and we are very interested in the history of work. So where I'd like to start is just this kind of idea of things that we've heard people say. What I hope is maybe you don't have people you work with who say these kinds of things, but maybe you do. We call these people care naysayers. People who really don't think about work as a place where you necessarily get fulfillment, where you feel excited to come every day. They think about it more as just a job. So here, one of my favorite ones here is you get a paycheck every 2 weeks. That's how I show you that I care. And what we're really trying to do is understand, how do we start to move the needle on this? How do we really get these people who are care naysayers to maybe start thinking a little bit differently about work? So one of the things that we wanted to do is kind of dig into, how did we get here? How did we get to this place where people say these kinds of things when many of us know that's not how we think about it on a personal level? So it's really about the history of work and these assumptions about what work is supposed to be. Those are the reasons why it feels taboo to say things like that we care about people or that we want to be kind to people. We just have this really interesting history that hasn't evolved very much over time. So some of those assumptions are these kinds of things. That work is contractual and even adversarial, meaning that the employee has a kind of adversarial relationship with the employer and vice versa, and that we're even trying to kind of screw each other over. We're trying to pull one over on each other. And because of that, because as the employer, I feel like you're trying to pull one over on me, I need to watch you really closely, right? So I have to monitor you. I have to surveil you. And I'm going to make sure if you're working outside the lines, that I'm going to course correct really fast and give you that negative feedback. And it's a lot about keeping score, like all the good things you've done for this company and making sure you haven't done any bad things. And that really at the end of the day, we think with these traditional assumptions that money is the only thing that motivates. Well, I say all these things out loud. It's almost kind of funny, right? They make us almost giggle because, of course, this is not the way we think about work now. It really is based on these old ways of the way work used to be. It was when work was a lot more routine, a lot more factory work. And it also had to do with work that was more about command and control and top-down and very patriarchal models of work. It was also a lot about compliance. Again, making sure people were working within the lines, staying within the rules. So it's a very outdated view of what work is now. So a quick poll question for you all. To what extent does your organization buy into these traditional assumptions about work? Remember, I was talking about this idea that work's contractual or adversarial, that you have to be watched, that people keep score, that you have get feedback that's mostly negative, and that money is the only thing that motivates. So if you would, take this poll question. We're very interested in seeing these results. Make sure at the end, at the bottom, when you take the question, that you click Submit. All right. So this is fascinating to me. I was curious about how this would go. So it looks like there are quite a few people who responded either to a very great extent or to a great extent. So about 30% of you said, yeah, my organization buys into some of these traditional assumptions. There's an interesting middle, right? Pretty big chunk of people in the middle. And I love that some of your organizations aren't doing this at all. So you can see, I'm fascinated by this distribution, right? It's a very kind of bell-shaped curve distribution of whether or not this is happening. These traditional assumptions are still in place. And what I really believe is that we are at a critical juncture. We absolutely have an opportunity to do something different. So what we think is there are multiple reasons for why now. Why now can we make these shifts, move away from these traditional assumptions about how work has to be into a place that's much more fulfilling and has more meaning. So the first reason why now is that the demands have changed. We aren't working on factory lines, all of us. Some people still are, but work is fundamentally different for many of us. It requires a lot more judgment, a lot more creativity, a lot more innovation. There really are whole new industries like data science and AI that never existed before. We also know from some research by Deloitte that work is a lot more complex than it used to be. So 80% of all companies rate their business as highly complex or complex for their employees. The workforce itself, besides the work changing, the workforce has really changed too. Almost 50% of the workforce is going to be millennials next year in 2020. Every time I say 2020, I can't believe it's next year. And what we know is that millennials tend to stay less time in organizations. Their tenures tend to be shorter. So 43% of millennials report leaving within the first 2 years of working in an organization. And I am so not a millennial basher or really a big believer that millennials or really any generations are that much different from everyone else. But I do think that millennials tend to have more courage to really walk away from bad work. So there really are indications around the demands for work and that the workforce has new demands around what work is about.
And there's an interesting question that came in from one of the attendees. It says, would you agree we are moving from the workforce being there for the management team to the management team being there for the workforce?
100%. That is such a critical part of this whole thing, is that we really have to start thinking about work from the perspective of the employee, that we're solving for the employee first, not for HR silos, not for leadership teams, not for management teams, but how the employee experience is valued, how it happens throughout the organization, that we're solving for the employee first. Great question. That's a huge shift. And that is really related to this next idea that our understanding of work and what matters at work has really evolved over time. What we know for sure is that culture is critical to having a great place to work. We know that well-being and inclusion and employee engagement all are statistically related to getting better business results. And we know that the employee experience is directly related to the customer experience. We really have a burning platform. The demands have changed and we know what the answers are. We know what we need to do differently. what we really want to encourage people to understand is that solving for the workforce of yesterday is not going to work going forward. And I'll just give a real quick example, a little story. I was talking to a CHRO of a large organization, and she was getting all excited about this idea that she really needed to rethink work, that she needed to attract all new talent. In fact, her organization was in competition with Google and Amazon for talent. And she said to me, we just radically have to change our culture. And I was getting really excited, and I was leaning in and like thinking, yay. And so I said, well, how are you going to do that? What's your approach? And she said, well, we're going to create a whole new compensation package. And I thought she was teasing. Honestly, it made me giggle, like, oh, that's funny, because that is a traditional approach. Of course, compensation matters, but that is not enough to solve for a great culture, to solve for the employee experience. So we really have to start be thinking differently and take this to a whole new level. So what we would argue here at Limeade is the place that we need to go is to actually authentically care for our employees as human beings. That is a critical part of this transition. And one of the things that Julia is going to talk about in just a few minutes is the science behind this, the science behind the concept of caring about people as human beings. It kind of sounds silly because we all know at a personal level, yeah, that's how I want to be treated, but there's actually really good, compelling science behind it. And there is this theory called organizational support theory that's at the kind of foundation of the science. And that's kind of from an academic perspective, it's called organizational support, and we call it CARE just as a simple way of describing it. So I want to pass it over to you, Julia, and have you take it from here.
Yes, thank you, Laura. So what I'll do in the next section is go through just some of the highlights of the research that Laura mentioned. There has been decades and decades of research on this topic that has linked employees feeling cared for and supported to not just good employee outcomes, but great business outcomes as well. And so we'll start with something that we've done at Limeade with Quantum Workplaces a couple of years ago. So what we found in our combined research was that when employees felt their employer cared about their well-being, they were 38% more engaged. Then another interesting study that starts to connect feeling cared for to performance was just released last year by Wang and colleagues. And what they did is they looked at leaders in China, in the US, in the military, and in the private sector, and they compared the different leadership styles. And so they looked at benevolent leaders, they looked at authoritarian leaders, and then they looked at leaders that kind of combined both traits. And what they found was that benevolent leaders, those that care about the well-being of their employees, right, those that really care about their people, had consistently better performing teams compared to the other leadership styles. So next, great places to work. They found that employees in high-trust culture who experience a caring workplace are 44% more likely to work for a company with above-average revenue growth. Now, this is just a correlation. It could go both ways, but again, the connection is there. And then there's more connection, too, to some of the important people outcomes. In this case, Gallup found that disengaged workers who don't feel valued, secure, supported, or respected miss more work, they make more mistakes, and they have more accidents. So some more research that we've done recently at Limeade, where we looked at employees feeling cared for by their organization and some of the employee-related outcomes. So the way to look at this chart is the green bar represents employee well-being, blue one represents employee engagement, the gray one is feelings of inclusion. And when employees felt that their organization did not care about them, consistently, well-being, engagement, and inclusion were much lower than the group that felt cared for. Similarly, in the same study, we looked at outcomes such as the intent to stay and likelihood to recommend the organization as a great place to work. Right? You can see the same trend where feeling cared for is connected to all these important outcomes. And then to wrap all of this up, I wanted to bring up this meta-analysis, a study of studies that was done 2 years ago by Cortesis and colleagues, where they looked at all the studies that have been done on this idea of support and care and connected it to people and business outcomes. And they found that when employees feel supported and cared for, their well-being is higher, their engagement is higher, their commitment is higher, and their performance is better. And what I like especially in that performance section is that it's not the immediate result for the employee's performance, but the secondary result. Things like customer satisfaction, customer service climate, right? Things that spill out to our customers and impact them as well.
What I love about this particular study, and Julia knows that I get excited about this is a meta-analysis. And so a meta-analysis is a study of studies, and I think this particular meta-analysis had 558 studies in it. So there's so much strong evidence for this table that she just presented to you. There's just really strongly supported from a research perspective. So we love seeing a great meta-analysis.
We sure do. Well, hopefully that was brief, but enough to show you that care matters, not just for employees, but also for organizations. And so what Laura is going to do next is really take us into how do you create a caring workplace? What are those elements?
Thanks, Julia. So we have this idea or this concept called elements of care. So you can think about this as sort of picking and choosing some different pieces here that really are the most important for your organization. We're not necessarily saying that you have to do all of these things, but we're just trying to give you an idea for a bunch of different ingredients or elements that you could use if you really want to focus on this in your organization. So there are 3 levels, and I'm going to walk you through each one of them. So at the most basic level, at the kind of foundational level, are these ideas: safety and security, dignity and respect, fairness and trust, and meaningful work. So safety and security has to do with things like basic safety, physical safety measures, sexual harassment prevention, pay, health insurance, benefits. Dignity and respect has to do with just those basic behavioral standards, right? That it's very clear in your organization that you just have to be nice and respectful to each other. Fairness and trust has to do with the policies that you have, the way people really do what they say they're going to do. Is there trust enough for people to have autonomy? And finally, this idea of meaningful work. Meaningful work is something we don't talk about that much. It's not that kind of sexy, but in my day, we used to talk a lot about job analysis and actually creating jobs that had kind of end-to-end ownership of things, that where you felt like I'm doing something important in my day-to-day work. So that's the most basic kind of foundational level of the elements of care.
Yeah, and I have a great example from one of our customers, Fortune Brands, around this idea of care and safety. So Fortune Brands has locations kind of all over the U.S., and they have a few in North Carolina. And so during Hurricane Florence, one of their branches was in the eye of the storm, really shutting down phone lines. Employees were feeling disconnected, and no one knew what was going on. And so the organization stepped in and used their employee experience platform to reach out to all employees, let everyone know what's going on, check in with them, and really find out what's happening with them, what do they need, what kind of support the organization could provide. And the employees started responding to things that were happening, things that they needed. And so the organization took it to kind of the next level and started reaching out with relevant resources for things that they needed. They started this donation fund, raising money to help the victims. So they really pulled together to help people in those affected areas.
Awesome. So that is the most basic level. Let's go to the next level. And so the next level has to do with whole person, listen and connect, recognize and act, and grow. At the first part of this is the idea of whole person well-being. So one of the questions that we just had come in was, what is well-being? The idea of well-being is this concept of feeling good and living with purpose. It's really feeling good in your head, feeling good in your body, how those two things work together, and having a reason to wake up every day. It's really this idea of quality of life. And the more organizations can support this concept of whole person well-being, the more people feel cared for, the more they feel like I matter to you as a human being. There's also inclusion and diversity, really thinking about the role the organization plays with stress and flexibility. Listening and connecting, do we have really good ways that go two ways to listen and connect with our employees? Are we transparent in our communications? Do we do a good job with recognizing people? Do we express gratitude? Do we act on what we hear? And then finally, grow. Do we really encourage people to have new opportunities, to develop, to take on new things, to take some risks in our organization? So that's the second level of that elements of care.
Yeah, and within that level too, we have another example from one of our customers, TE Connectivity. This one is all about listening and acting. So what they've done, again, in their employee experience platform, is they simply started asking employees, how should we use this? What should be in here? What could be most helpful to you? And they started getting a lot of great ideas, which they used, but the one that stood out to them the most was around learning and development. They learned that employees struggled accessing learning and development resources because they were in different places. They had to figure out how to get them. They had to figure out how to find time. And so they really used that as a way to address the learning and development needs by putting that in that one platform and letting employees know that it's right there in one place for you so you can get to everything you need to from one place. And that really helped drive usage of learning and development tools, and it also helped employees feel like the company listened to them.
Great. Okay, and the top level of this idea of the elements of care have to do with finding purpose and really kind of extending outside of the organization to really work on creating a better world. So the first one is how we think about helping our employees understand their own personal purpose and maybe how it connects to the purpose of the organization. That's so powerful when there is that kind of connection. When we have leaders that are inspiring, that help us see something bigger, that make us feel connected in this bigger way. And then how we extend that care outside of the organization, the concept of corporate social responsibility, philanthropy, that we really want to care for the world. So those are the basic levels. What I think is really important to know, it also has to do with all the behaviors that are in between, right? That it's about how leaders and managers and employees, how they really are with each other. Are they kind and authentic, and do they listen, and do they encourage? That matters so much. But I think some organizations tend to over-rely on the goodness of the hearts of the people who work there and don't also have systematic approaches, really consistent ways to show their employees they care. So think about those elements of care as places that you could go to start building that consistency. So we'd like to do a little pulse check question. So the question is, do you currently do any of these elements of care at your organization? So we're going to do a quick pulse check, and it's just going to be a yes or no, thumbs up or thumbs down. Do you do these things now? So if you would, go ahead and participate in the pulse check. Okay, yay. One person, all right. We got it even. Let's get some more people participating. The question again is, oh good, here they come. Does your organization participate in some of these? Look at, interesting how it's coming in. It's like 50, double that yes, but about half saying no. Awesome. So what we have now are about 33 saying yes and 12 saying no. So again, I think this is really interesting that there seems to be in many organizations, again, it's not all yes, it's not all no. There's a lot of variability from organization to organization regarding whether or not their companies are doing these kinds of things. So a takeaways, and then I think we'll have maybe a minute for some questions. What we hope you take away from this, there's a lot we covered in a really short period of time, but what we hope you take away is we should all be challenging the assumptions about work because they're very much old school. They're based on an old way of thinking about work, and work has changed. Our demands also, the workforce demands have changed as well. What we also hope you see is that care is good for employees and it's also good for your organization. You get better business results when your employees feel cared for. And that there's all kinds of ways that your organization can show that it cares, and we hope that you keep thinking about building that out. So with one last kind of challenge to you, we hope that you create an employee experience where every employee knows that their company cares. So let's maybe take one or two questions before we wrap up. And I'm just going to take a look. So this is a question that says, do you think organizations that don't care increase stress for employees? Well, funny you should say that. We had so much data, so much science to provide that we actually had to cut some things out. We, in some research that we did here at Limeade Institute, we found a high correlation between the idea of care and reduced stress and reduced burnout. So we definitely see that when people, and the opposite being true, when people feel more cared for, it helps with their stress levels. We've also seen that in the well-being space, that when people feel like they have more well-being in their life, they have less stress. So yes, and I think that's not only stuff that research we've found, but that's also supported in other external research too.
There's another good question here around culture, how culture helps in retaining employees who are leaving the company for better monetary benefit.
Yeah, so that's interesting. We just happen to have some examples of that here at Limeade, where we had two people who just came back to our organization. We are a growth company. We try to pay competitively, but there are lots of big tech companies that can pay people a lot of money in the Seattle area where we're located. And we have had people come back and they say it's because of our culture. So I think that day-to-day experience, how people are treated, it's not about the fancy kind of perks. It's not about always about the paycheck. It's about feeling cared for and valued. So we would make a strong argument that yes, that matters. And culture absolutely can be your competitive advantage. So I think we're out of time now. There's some other questions. I would love to dig into these even more with you, but we just want to thank you for listening today and thank you for your time. And that's the end of the session. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Alrighty, my thanks to both Laura and Julia. That was a great presentation. Definitely a lot of questions coming in. I will send those to you later, and you can answer those, on your own time after the session has ended. So again, my thanks to both of you.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, time for our final presentation of the day. It's all about the candidate experience. Please join us in the next session by clicking on the next link in your email or by clicking the next session in your agenda widget. Don't forget to click already registered. All right, everyone, I will see you there.